And we want to welcome everyone back to this iteration on ethics education. This yesterday was extremely exciting and thought provoking, and with our group of scholars that we've assembled here to talk about these very crucial matters. Yesterday we had some foundational conversation about what ethics means, how do we define it, how do we theorize about it, and which do we think is the most compelling. And the consensus coming from what my studies had been several years ago at the University of Miami, began there and continues to be, is that there's something special about the ethics of care that, to me and to others like Dr. Sloat on the panel, that that there's something special about the ethics of care that's both human and humanizing. It speaks to our basic instincts of mothering and caring. And with that, we can explore and amplify the notion of care and see what it means in all kinds of theory, including political theory, educational theory, um, um, and how care then is a wonderful friend to empathy. They go really hand in hand. So this kind of altruistic notion or defining of what altruism is, and that is being concerned about other people or other regarding, is a philosophical concept and idea, but there's a whole lot of it in the language of religion, in the language of theological ethics, particularly in the conversations of the work of Jesus and many others of those who did that work. And I hope that today Dr. Sloat in his time will say something a little bit more about his great work he's been doing in the ancient world, in terms of the ancient world, but the Asiatic world, over in Asia, in China, and works about what the implications for virtue ethics and care over there. But what we're doing is the National Center for Bioethics and Research in Healthcare at Tuskegee University, where I serve as the lead ethicist, the interim director, and an associate professor, and as well as the editor of the journal. The National Center is concerned about how we move forward and what ethical stance do we move forward that brings it all together, ethics together, so that we could be in solidarity with the least, the lost, and the left out. There's a whole lot of people who feel, and by right, are not included in conversations because of who they are, where they're from, and what they have. The National Center is promoting this notion of Black bioethics as a way of getting at those people. When I speak of Black bioethics, we're not speaking in terms of pigmentation as much as we're thinking about identification and orientation. We're talking about a particular kind of protest language that began many years ago in liberation theology and liberation talk about how do we get to people who lack access. So Black bioethics, as a kind of friend to Black theology and other kinds of Blackness, is about protest. It's about the least, the lost, and left out. It's about going after the LGBTQ community and saying we love you. It's about going after immigrants and saying we love you, or so-called immigrants. It's about going after poor whites or poor anybody and say we love you. It's not about just being in America, it's about being around the world. And that's what Black bioethics reaches out to do. It's about tribal communities, indigenous communities, and reminding them and reminding ourselves of our love for them. All of this came as a result of 623 plus men and their families who were unjustly and unethically treated in an unjust, unethical syphilis study by the United States Public Health Service syphilis study at Tuskegee. And that's a study for that non-therapeutic study for 40 years, from 1932 to 1972. These men didn't even know they were in a study. They were given aspirin and other small medicinal drugs to take, and back rubs and such. They were given spinal taps, which were extremely painful. And this kept going on for 40 years. The United States government sanctioned it. the director of the CDC, Dr. John Cutler, when he was asked the question, how could you do this? He said, we would do it again because we had good intentions. So ethics of care is, if ethics of care would say to us, the fact that it's hurting and harming is very Hippocratic. If it's harming someone and hurting someone, then it is not something that we should be doing. We should find other ways of thinking about these things. Ladies and gentlemen, back in the late 60s, in a little town outside of Chicago, it's called Skokie, Illinois, there was a group of Holocaust survivors who lived there, Jewish survivors who lived there. They weren't bothering anybody. The Nazis and the neo-Nazis decided to march on Skokie, and and they said they had freedom of speech to say whatever they wanted to say. And therefore, it seems like they had the right to do so because of freedom of speech. Would you believe that a United States justice said, well, what they need to do is avert their ears? In other words, when they hear the racial slurs and the real horrific language of the marchers, what they were supposed to do is just look away. But the problem is, by that time, they've already heard the slang. They've already heard the language. The hurt, harm, and damage had already been done. However, so the greatest of ethics, whether it's deontology, whether it's utilitarianism, consequentialism, they gave justification for these men, for these anti-Semitics to speak their so-called truth. However, care ethics would abandon all of that and said the point is this: if it causes harm, if it doesn't demonstrate care, it is not the kind of ethics that we want to associate with. And therefore, the National Center is moving in that vein. Now, on the screen with me, yesterday, Dr. Sloat began by breaking down all kinds of ethics for us and ended with care ethics and empathy ethics to demonstrate how we will move forward. And today he will have much more to say about that. Going first would be Dr. Riggins Earl. And yesterday, he gave us kind of historical retrospective about what kinds of things the National Center should be doing, the National Center for Bioethics should be doing, so that it is not stagnant, so that it is reaching the least, the lost, and the left out. And he made some very beautiful points, and he shall further the conversation. But today, my host partner is my brother, Dr. Lachlan Farrell. Dr. Farrell is my brother. And the only difference between us is that I wear glasses and he doesn't. All right. I'm a little taller, perhaps a little chubbier. Oh, there goes the glasses. He is a palliative care physician and palliative care over the Palliative Care Center. I was before he retired. And I will say this: his retirement was not retirement, but repurposing, to use the word of Dr. Susan Reverby, so that he could give more time to the dismantling of racism in bioethics, in public health ethics, and racism generally. And I'm just his partner in doing this. So we come together regularly to have discussions about how this dismantling could take place. And I'm telling you, he gives me some wonderful thoughts and ideas. I wish he could mention something about the social work program in Colorado that his daughter is a part of. Why is this important? Because if we're going to be doing Black bioethics, that is a departure from only mainstream bioethics, then we need to be concerned about homelessness. We need to be concerned about mental health. We need to be concerned about pretrial detention and mass incarceration and lupus and autism and these other things that are not on the calculus of excess deaths like hypertension and HIV and diabetes, but they lead to death in many different ways. So Dr. Farrell and I have this wonderful conversation. He is the Albert Schweitzer Fellow and president of the Albert Schweitzer, I hope I said right, Foundation. But what I'm saying is he will clarify that. But what he brings to the table is a unique skill set, a unique skill set to kind of discuss these matters. So I'm going to step back, and he's going to take the leadership from here until we get to the end. And I present to you Dr. Lachlan Farrell, my brother, and he is going to give a lead up with a small presentation about, and then he's going to allow Dr. Earl and then Dr. Sloat to go. Thank you very much. Dr. Lachlan Farrell.
All right, thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I thought what I would do would be just some of you were with us yesterday, maybe most of you, but also for myself, sort of anchor us to begin today in reviewing a little bit about what we talked about yesterday. And I was going to say a few things and then maybe tee up, including some questions for Dr. Earl, Dr. Sloat, but all of you in the audience. And I can look at my little outline that I made here for myself. First, a couple additional things about Black bioethics. So Dr. Hodge, my brother David, emphasized Black in this case does not mean skin color pigmentation. And it's a concern about the marginalized, the least, the lost, and left out. But I want to add a couple of other things. Everything that we are doing, everything we're going to do through the National Center for Bioethics at Tuskegee is anchored in, centered in, driven by the reason why that National Center which was created, which was the mistreatment of 623, people are recounted, might be 625 men and their families over decades. And we always have them in mind and try to see issues through their eyes. It's almost as if Black bioethics is a lens anybody can put on for seeing and understanding things. But it's not just a lens, it requires a deeper understanding, as Dr. Hodge mentioned yesterday, a paper wrote about, what is it like to be Black? And understanding that, I think Dr. Sloat may elaborate a little more about empathy is not just a feeling, it depends on an understanding of the person that you're trying to respond to. But I want to go even further than that. When we talk about least, the lost, left out, or people are marginalized, we often think of them in terms of their suffering, their weaknesses, and their difficulties. But if you look back at the history of people identified in this country as Black, as African Americans, they bring and always have in that adversity just extraordinary strengths from their experiences, the wisdom, the passion, the solidarity, the talents. So we think that in the experience of those men and their families and what they represent of countless millions of people in the United States identified as Black, that there's wisdom about understanding things, including in our own lives and how we should live. So there's strength in this history, not just identifying problems. In addition, as Dr. Earl reminded us talking yesterday about the history of Tuskegee University and Booker T. Washington. Can you hear me because of the dogs barking? Is that a problem? No, you're good. That until 1972, everybody in this country who heard the word Tuskegee knew anything about it. What Tuskegee meant, the word meant, was Black excellence, Booker T. Washington, education, talent, all of that. So we want to be emphasizing that Black bioethics is not just about marginalized, suffering, left out people. It's about ways of demonstrating excellence. The third last thing I'm going to say about Black bioethics. People have expressed concern to me about, but the issues are not just Black bioethics. Women, like, where's the place for women in this? What about Native people? Dr. Hodge talked about them and others. And the way I think about Black bioethics, using a musical metaphor, is it's not, we're not trying to say this is the one way of thinking of things. We're saying this is a strand, this is a way of looking at things that will be side by side with Native American ways of looking at things, what you can call white or Kantian or other traditional bioethics ways of looking at things, womanist ways of looking at things, disability community, they all have wisdom, and all of those have their own unique contributions. We're going to focus on the Black bioethics part, but I think of it as again, what originated in this country in Black communities as jazz. That the greatest success of the National Center for Bioethics and our work in Black bioethics isn't going to be that everybody sees things as Black bioethics. It's going to be we've contributed to a rich diversity of different ways of understanding ethical issues. We're going to be learning from others and hopefully enrich each other. Dr. Sloat yesterday gave us a mini course in thousands of years of histories of different ways of thinking about ethics and rules, principles, Kantianism, deontology, consequences, virtue, character, concern about others. Today, I hope Dr. Sloat, he promised us yesterday, is going to get into the practical applications. And again, taking what I just said about jazz, I was a philosophy major 1,000 years ago and learned a lot about Kantian and consequentialist and other ethics. And for me, it would be a mistake to say the right answer is care ethics and not these others. When I think about any moral issue, when I look at it through the lens of Kantian principles, I find I understand some important things. Any ethics that doesn't care about the consequences, to me, seems just completely wrong. Any ethics that doesn't think about the characteristics of me, the agent, my virtues, seems wrong. And any ethics that isn't understanding things in terms of empathy and caring, I think, is missing something important. So I'm going to hope that Dr. Sloat later on talk some about, are we saying care ethics instead of these other things? And how does that work? Also, a question previewing for Dr. Sloat. My brother David yesterday about a paper he wrote about what is it like to be Black. If we're going to be understanding how these problems that we're trying to eliminate, racism, these things happen, we need to actually not just condemn people like Dr. Cutler, who said he would do it again. We need to understand, how did a human being like Dr. Cutler come to take pride in what he was doing? And when I sit here just briefly imagining being Dr. Cutler, here my brother David, sounds like, he didn't say this exactly, but suggesting that the problem was I didn't have empathy, I didn't care. I imagine if I'm Dr. Cutler, I'm getting angry at David because I devoted my life to trying to improve the problems of syphilis and all the suffering in Macon County among these people. I cared deeply about these people. Yes, I did things that for some individual men in the study was not a benefit to them, but we had to learn things because we didn't at the time think we understood how syphilis actually worked in Black bodies. And if we didn't understand that, we were never going to help them. So if you accuse me, Dr. John Cutler, of not caring, I think you're completely wrong. I think you guys are sentimentalist, warm, touchy-feely people who say, oh, we're going to be warm, touchy-feely with all these other people. We're never going to really learn and understand through science what we need, and we need to do science in order to help these people. And that's what I was about, and you're just wrong, okay? As I find myself saying that, it starts to make sense to me, even though I think it's wrong. But I think Dr. Sloat and others need to help us not just understand for ourselves how do we live ethically, but the people that we think are not living ethically or historically have been absolutely unethical. We need to do more than just condemn them. We need to bring empathy to understanding how did they get it so wrong, or we'll never learn how to live together with others. And we all know in this country, there are tens of millions of people who today disagree with a lot of what we are trying to do with the National Center. And one of my heroes for this is Gandhi, who said, I'm not interested in defeating my enemies. I'm interested in converting them so they become my friends. That may not be possible. In fact, I believe it's impossible for too many people in this country. I would not invest a lot of time in trying to convert some people or win them over. But we need to, I think, understand that a lot of people who currently are doing things we think are unethical are people that we actually want to work with. And I think empathy can help us with that. last thing, looking at Dr. Earl, I'd love to hear more today, and love hearing the dialogue I think you're going to have with Dr. Sloat, concretely about 10 or 20, or maybe after we're long, 50 years from now, what will Tuskegee University be like? If you're a student there, if you're a faculty member, if you're a staff member there, what will it be like if Dr. Hodge and the National Center has succeeded in the ways that we are hoping to? And Tuskegee University, not just Tuskegee University, Dr. Hodge and I and others are determined that we're going to work in harmony with, solidarity with, learn from, again, the jazz metaphor, Morehouse, Howard, historically Black colleges and universities, that each of them has their own unique history, strengths, virtues, character that we want to work together with. And then the last thing I'll say, lesson from Africa. I spent time in Africa. I don't remember if I'd mentioned this yesterday or not, but one of the most important things I learned, an African saying, and this is for all of you who are listening or joining this, we hope will ask questions. And the African saying is, be very, very careful when you point your finger at anyone. It's usually pointing to condemn Dr. Cutler or somebody else, or people in politics in our country. Be careful when you're pointing your finger at anyone, but also be careful when pointing your finger at somebody. Oh, Dr. Sloat has the answers. Because your hand is much smarter than you are, and 3 of your 4 fingers are pointing where you should be focusing. Not just because I myself am most responsible for myself, but I actually think all ethics ends up being very, very simple in terms of a question, because I, as a human being, as an agent, as a person, an entity in this world, I only have control, actually, over one thing in this world, and that is me and what I do in and with my life. I think the whole field of bioethics has done too much of what all of us do, which is, and what I'm doing with myself is telling Dr. Sloat, Dr. Earl, Dr. Hodge what to do. Yeah, that's one way I can spend my life energy. But starting at home, I hope all of you in the audience listening to this, is any of this useful for you after we finish at 3 o'clock Eastern time, having a clearer sense of what you need to figure out, what you want to do, so that you yourself, I myself, I learned a lot yesterday, I'm going to go forward living a life that I am more proud of. I think that means a more ethical, moral life in ways that might contribute to the healing the National Center is trying to spark. So I'm going to stop there. Thanks for listening to that. And I think, if I understood, Dr. Earl, we're going to hear from you next, and then Dr. Sloat, and then today, I think, hope, please put questions in the Q&A on the web. We got to them fairly late yesterday. We're hoping you'll have lots of questions. If we can't answer all of them adequately here, you'll have helped us know the kinds of questions that we need to work and find answers to, so that people like you who've joined our webinar have been helped by the work we're doing. So thank you, Dr. Earl, or Pop, as my brother David has taught me to call him.
May I ask a question to David
Yes.
Hodge?
Yes.
David, I have things that I'd like to say in response to Dr. Foro. Now, the question is, when do I do that? I mean, it's going to eat away into what I positively want to say. Should it be in the question period? When should it be?
So since I'm the moderator now, Michael, I would love you to identify 3, 4 topics, like quick things, and then use your time later to go into them in more depth. Would that be?
What do you mean,
something
right
you can say
now?
quickly? Yeah, just, or you can just keep track of them, and then after Dr. Earl, you can come back in more detail.
No, I'm dividing this up into 2 things. First, what I wanted to say about empathy and caring, and second, what I wanted to say in response to your doubts about some of the things I was saying. Now, when do I do the latter?
I think it's okay. I think it's okay to take 5 minutes now and not infringe upon your time later to respond to those things, as well as.
Yes, and actually, thank you, Mike. I'm going to say one other thing. What you referred to, the doubts that I expressed. I'm not sure that actually I have all the doubts that I expressed. One of the things we are going to be doing in the National Center is, for anything inviting the hardest possible questions, doubts, all of those things, because even if I'm not having them myself, even if I figure them out, I've read your books, I've learned a lot from them, I'm trying to say out loud things that I think people listening might have doubts about.
Sure.
Because I think the only way we get through things is to welcome those questions. So I will own the doubts I expressed, but I'd like you to be thinking of the people who are listening to this. They heard the doubts I expressed, and how would you respond?
I only want to respond because I think you're right. The people who are listening may have similar doubts, or you may arouse similar doubts by what you've said. So let me say something by way of response here, because you raised some very good points. First of all, there's the issue of, why care ethics or empathy care ethics rather than these other approaches. They all seem to have their insights. Now, the first thing to notice is that these ethical approaches are inconsistent with one another at their roots, okay? And about particular cases, they yield different judgments. I'm going to give you an example later, for example, where both consequentialism and Kantian liberalism seem to get the thing wrong, and they differ, therefore. I think David Hodge actually mentioned the case of Skokie. They differ from what the enlightened ethical view would be of the matter. So, so I do think that we need to filter some of the great insights of these other traditions through the deepening and humanizing focus of care ethics. But we can't have everything. We can't affirm all these theories because they're actually inconsistent with one another. Then you ask a very good question about how do you deal with the uncaring people in society? Okay, the idea that we can convert them is a pie in the sky. It's really pie in the sky. So I think the answer is that sometimes we have to fight against their uncaringness. We have to fight against their ethical corruption and lack of caring. That's something that a caring person has to do. We mentioned yesterday that the caring has, and David Hodge mentioned, the caring has implications for the larger issues of social justice. Absolutely. And where there are lots of uncaring people around, those who are caring need to either oppose or undermine or qualify what those others are doing in order to create the more caring society that the care ethicist thinks we should have. So those are my answer to what you're saying. Remember the old saying, in order for evil to triumph, all that is necessary is that for good men to do nothing. So I think we got to do something. The good, caring people have to do something. They can't just hope to convert. They have to do something.
All right. Thank you. Dr. Earle, Pop, on to you.
Okay.
Greetings, everyone. Greetings, everyone. Yeah, that's good. Good to see you. And Dr. Hodge, Dr. Sloat, Dr. Sloat. Hold on, I see what it is. Hold on just a minute. All right. Is that better? You hear me now?
Yes,
okay,
very clearly.
Very good. Thank you, and you have stimulated me, the intellectual stimulation and the emotional stimulation is very, very forceful now, and it's exciting. There have been a lot of provocative things said, but I want to go back and start really with Dr. Farrow and Lachlan, my brother, and raise some issues that that I think we have to face with this. You raised it, and I'll start with you, Lachlan, because you said 50 years from now, and we look back and the question, that generation will have to face the question of Well, did they do what they said they were going to try and do? I think that's a fair representation of what you said. And that has concerned me for this reason, that in studying the mission statements of the National Bioethicity, I have struggled with that question, and I think that what it has made me face is: are we transferring our sense of messiahism onto the center? In other words, in our apologies, in our questions about the center, or in our visions for the center, is a better way to say it. And it's typical, I think, of Black people who, in this country where we've had so little, to dream that our dream becomes so big until we don't have the muscle to deliver. And here's what I mean by that. I wonder, and I've had to struggle with, why do we do this? Because when the White Bioethics Centers started, and I started my teaching career at the University of Tennessee, not long after the ethical language became the language of bioethics, and medical ethics became big in the conversations of the academy. Now, I'm not sure how big they were in the mass society, but I remember the Childress and Beauchamp, I think it was Childress and Beauchamp book, quite a piece. And Childress, I think it was at Yale, and got a professorship to go to the University of Virginia at Charlottesville. And there he and Beauchamp put together, or they put together before he went there, this book. And at the University of Tennessee, a colleague of mine by the name of Charles Reynolds was starting in the religious part, the Journal of Christian Ethics, I think is what they called it, the Journal of Christian Ethics. He didn't like that title, but it was already in vogue, had been in vogue for years, heavily influenced by people like Paul Ramsey, who used to be at Princeton. I think was Dr. Sloat. Did you say you studied under Paul Ramsey? Yeah. Doctor. Yes.
I did not know.
No, Professor Ramsey was one of my most important teachers in college.
Right. Yeah. Right. And of course, he was a big voice in ethical discourse, especially Christian ethics, as I came out in my teaching career. And when I did graduate study at Vanderbilt, we were using one of his publications. And I always wondered why Ramsey was so animated and dynamic in delivery and thought-provoking, but he had, and this was during the days of the civil rights struggle, etc., why he had so little to say about social justice. But he made his own kind of contribution in a kind of pipe smoking tradition. He loved his pipe. But I'm wondering if the ethics centers that have been started have seemingly been general in their focus. Georgetown has been the Georgetown Bioethics Center has been very particular, and its sense of in that tradition of what I call Aristotelian tradition, and I think I'm reading it correctly. That Georgetown has been unapologetic in terms of the way Catholics have interpreted, or at least acknowledging that they are being informed by Thomistic ethics, the ethics of virtue, and also, I guess it's Abelard, the ethics of has also contributed, influenced that the way the background for the philosophical background for the starting of that center. But they end with the Gospel of John and the whole understanding as an understanding of care and love and healing. How do we in the national 50 years from now, can the generation of an oncoming generation look back and say, okay, were they able to do what they said? And maybe not. But here's my concern. The Tuskegee Bioethics Center the National Bioethics Center at Tuskegee came about as a result of the need for this nation to atone, using your language, Lachlan, to atone for its sins and violation of these men's humanity, of an ethnic group's humanity. And of course, the monies that were given at that time was seen by, or it can be seen, or at least I see it, as atonement money. We are paying for the sins of our fathers. They use the biblical language, our fathers, and in this case, our fathers and mothers. But that, and of course, it lost, it seemingly as it went on, because as monies dwindled, their resources dwindled, they lost the cutting edge of being a center for to address a particular need, an ethnic group, the need to include African Americans in the ethical discourse, a conversation that had left the nation in such an embarrassing situation. If that is the case, if we read it that way, it means now that what we are burdened with is, how do we get the resources to revisit what the earlier leaders of the center at least said they were undertaking? All right, let me see if I can back up now and say it the way that I'm feeling it. And that is, can a bioethics center make its focus on the needs of a lost and forgotten people, or the marginally outcast? How can they do it without being burdened by the nation that gives them the money, or by the people who give them the money, to be burdened with the charge that you're being, do I want to say race? No, it's not that you're because they can't be racist. They don't have the resources systemically to be racist. But you're ignoring other people. I always said when I work with my white colleagues that you all want us to be the saviors that you have no interest in doing. You want us to work the miracles that you have long abandoned the desire to be miracle workers. The Enlightenment removed you from that, so you don't have an interest in that poor people who have been shackled and exploited, and here you see I'm getting at also the pedestrian level of Black religion that Booker T. Washington knew that he was struggling against. That we'll just take it to the Lord in prayer and depend on the Lord to make this happen. I used to say to my white colleagues at the University of Tennessee, you all don't even use that language, not even in the church, because your resources has enabled you to say, okay, we'll do it. We'll pledge this and we'll pledge that. We got these resources. We'll go get this grant, etc. The Tuskegee Institute, Tuskegee, the National Bioethics Center at Tuskegee, the same cases at Harvard, the same cases at other Black medical schools, who can barely get the monies to even persevere and survive. So we are caught in that reality, and I heard you mention it, Lachlan, and it's a reality that if we try to save everybody, we will be accused of, if we try to save everybody and our resources are so limited, then we'll be accused of, well, you all didn't do what you said you would do, so we don't have the money to put into a place like the National Bioethics Center. To me, this is a real ethical problem, because it is the return to blaming the victim. That the victim is being blamed for not doing what the society says that the majority of society says you need to do. And I think that's the dilemma at every level of Black life in America, where we are relying on grants and fundings to get the resources to make things happen, to change the situation. So, in what sense is the Tuskegee National Bioethics Center not only did it come about as a result of atonement money, but in what sense is the burden of it becoming an atonement institution laid on it? That seems to me a heavy load to carry. And let me mention several other around what I've already said. Let me say a little more about the religious side of ethics, and then turn it back to you, because I want to hear Dr. Sloat, and also we want to benefit from the question and answer session that hopefully this session has provoked. One of the things that I want to get at is, if we create programs for Black colleges and universities, historically Black colleges and universities, and we need to do that, an ethics program, because I don't hear enough among college students and among university faculty in historically Black schools. I don't hear enough conversation about the ethical, not at the academic level. I hear it at the pedestrian level of kind of a Sunday school response to right and wrong, etc. But I think we have to raise it to an academic level so we can understand not only public policy, but the ethical flaws in the government's distribution of resources in the name of public policy, if I'm making sense. That is that we have a tendency to feel guilty if we have a program like the National Bioethics Center at Tuskegee, and the government says, "Okay, we're going to give you 300,000 or 500,000." Well, hell, that's no money. Given the vision that you're talking about, Dr. Hodge, that's no money. And it's not. It's almost as though there's an idea, a mindset in the government that they don't know how, or they're not prepared to handle the monies that we would give, the kind of monies we would give to a Georgetown or to the University of Alabama, that center down there at Birmingham. Isn't that a medical or at least a bioethics center or a medical ethics center, ethics program there with the medical school? But the idea is that I'm afraid that Black educators and leaders have internalized that kind of insecurity about themselves, inferiority, that are we worthy to be responsible for that kind of money? I don't think we can help change the situation. I mean, I think of just that, not just the issue, and I'm going to close here. I'm going to end it. Not just the issue of the Bioethics Center, but there is a problem with the way we have understood the government's funding of historically Black colleges and universities. That we almost have said to ourselves, because we don't fight and protest about it, we haven't up until this point, that there have been Black leaders who have become more vocal about it. But how is it that Black leadership could go all these years and see that these schools were terribly underfunded, unless they just concluded that they have no value? But it is in these schools that democracy, the understanding, the vision of democracy was kept alive. It wasn't kept alive at other mainline institutions. And until we accepted as African Americans that we were the bearers of the vision of democracy in a society that created the apartheid system and kept us as the underdogs for all of these decades. We kept alive, and I'm going back to W.E.B. Du Bois in his whole understanding of the value and purpose of Black institutions. It was there that the seed of the germ of democracy was kept alive and kept hope alive, that when the white professors came over and would teach at our schools, and we were able to relate to them, et cetera, and we didn't see them as being, as the society had seen us, we didn't see them in the Black community as being outcasts. Now, the society saw them often as being outcasts. So that's a part of the narrative that we have to bring into this effort of bioethics, of Black bioethics, because for so many in the society, even for Blacks, when you put Black on it, they get afraid and say, "Oh, no, we're talking about everybody." Well, we have been talking about everybody since the beginning of slavery in this country, and especially the fight to be freed from slavery. We were talking about everybody then. We never excluded the majority of people. So that's an ethical, a moral burden that we wear as an ethnic group, that we can't come to the conversation of bioethics ignoring what that burden has been and how we can use that burden to help everybody in the society to better understand the quality and better understand the search for the quality of life. Thank you very much, and we'll listen for the responses.
All right, thank you, Pop. I think Michael, in transition, I'm going to try to connect some of the things I heard Dr. Earl Pop say to topics you might address, but I don't want to derail you if you have some prepared thoughts. As Pop, Dr. Earl is telling us, for me, reminding us of the role of African Americans in this country in helping us take democracy seriously and be what we've claimed to be. And when I think back to Frederick Douglass, his famous, what is the 4th of July speech to me, the part that's replayed most often these days is the second half, where it just says it's all hypocrisy and means nothing. Every time I hear about this, it makes me feel even worse about the realities that I and people like me have lived through. But the first half of that speech is a passionate celebration of the ideals this country was founded for. And then the second half is saying, and it's all been hypocrisy, right? But the ideals. And Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., over and over and over again, was challenging this country to live up to the ideals in the Declaration, saying that this country, in his I Have a Dream speech, issued a promissory note and has violated. Now, the Bank of Justice is not bankrupt, he claimed, but holding up those ideals. And in Nell Nodding's work that my brother David had directed me toward, she takes it down to the individual level, the motivation that someone like me may have to be a more caring person is because if I really think about myself and the person I aspire to be, I wish I was, that's a kind of ideal. And most of what I learned in ethics, in Kant, deontology, consequentialism, whatever, almost never talk about ideals. So I'm wondering whether in some of the things that Dr. Earl was talking about, whether some of the caring, empathy, ethics has anything to do with ourselves individually living up to our ideal, or who I would like to be, aspire to be, which then I have some motivation toward, and also more broadly, people in this country. And for me, my own work plan, helping Dave, whatever, a focal point for almost everything I do is July 4th, 2026, which is less than 3 years away, because that's the 250th anniversary of July 4th, 1776. There's going to be lots of conversation as they get close, but we need to have honest conversations about that, including that it's also the 417th, will be the 417th anniversary of 1619, which is also a part of our history. And so then another dimension, if, and then I'm going to stop and let you talk to us, if any of us listening are thinking about becoming or being the caring, empathic person, and that resonates with me, and I have ideals, I wish I was more caring than I am, how do I get that? I think that a lot of our Black and other teachers have taught us it's all at high risk of being self-deceptive, romantic BS, unless I look back honestly at myself and my past and who I've been and what kept me from being the way I aspire to do. This country has to do that better. So in this care ethics, we're going to be serious about becoming more caring. What's the role of understanding honestly our past individually, why we weren't caring, and are the lessons in this for our country? So those are the thoughts on my mind. You had some, I think, prepared remarks, and just before we got officially went on camera, you said Dr. Earl yesterday had provoked a lot of helpful, interesting thinking. So let me just hand it over to you, Dr. Sloat.
Well, okay, and thank you. I want to proceed, I think, with what I prepared for today, and then toward the end or at the end, I'll talk about what I learned from Dr. Earl, especially yesterday, though today as well. And then if there's time, I might say a little bit about understanding our past, but I have a feeling there won't be enough time for that, and maybe that could spill over into the question period. Anyway, let me give you my prepared talk. So yesterday I talked about care ethics as based on empathy, and I gave you a general criterion for when for wrongdoing. Wrongdoing is what shows us as less. It shows us as uncaring, or shows us as lacking in empathic concern for others. That would be the criterion that I would offer on behalf of care ethics and have done in print. But there are questions about, for example, Dr. Earl spoke of the role of schools, okay, in our learning to be caring and empathic. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment. First, I'd like to introduce to you 3 methods of instilling greater empathy. Okay, 3 methods by which people become more empathic. Okay, and these are in the literature. Okay, the first, and I think perhaps the most important one, is what Martin Hoffman, in his book The Ethics of Care and Empathy, calls inductive discipline, or for short, induction. This is not what the philosophers of science mean by induction. It means inducing empathy into individuals. How does this work? Well, according to Hoffman, and I agree with him, if parents see their child, let's say, knock down another child and run off to play, okay, rather than punishing their child, they may simply get their child back to their circle and say to them, look what you did. Okay, remember how you felt when someone knocked you down last week. So think about what you've done here. This little kid here, he's crying, you heard him. So what Hoffman says is that if you have a normal, well-loved child, that will get to them. That will make them feel sorry for what they've done. And that will increase their empathy toward the future, okay? It may take a number of times for this kind of thing to occur, but eventually the child will hesitate to harm another child because the child remembers how bad he felt about how bad he made the other child feel on other occasions, okay? So that's induction. Now, there's another basis for improving or enhancing or increasing empathy that Nancy Chodorow, in her book, The Caring Child, so I say Nancy Chodorow, sorry, Nancy Eisenberg, Eisenberg. Nancy Eisenberg, in her book, The Caring Child, talks about something called modeling. And modeling occurs when the parent, okay, is themselves a caring person, and the child sees what their caring parent does and models themselves on the parent. Now, this doesn't have to be deliberate. It can seep in. It's actually a form of empathy that you take in your parents' attitudes, but also your parents' dispositions, okay? And if they're caring people, inherently, a well-loved child well-loved child ethically unconscious way. And so a child with parents who are caring people, okay, will tend to become more caring too, more empathic too, just through the empathy seeping into them from their parents, okay? Now, the third technique, and this actually is a technique for enhancing or increasing children's empathy, is mentioned, I think she's the first to mention it, by Ruth Charney, Charney, in her book, Teaching Children to Care. And it involves role play, okay? So let's say you have a class and you want to increase the caringness and empathic concern for others that is felt or is a tendency among the children in the class, you divide the children into two groups. And you say, well, one of you should play Nazis, and the other group should play Holocaust victims. Or one group should play slave owners, and the other should play slaves, okay? And then act it out with each other, okay? And then after a period in which they're acting the thing out, the teacher says, now reverse it. Those of you who have been the Nazis, now you become the Holocaust victims or survivors, and vice versa. And similarly, if the issue were slaveholders and slaves, those who were slaves should become slaveholders. Now, what this does, if you're interacting on that basis, is to give you a sense of what it's like to be that way, okay? And understanding what something is like, okay, is a key to developing the capacity to understand and be sensitive to what a child who wasn't sensitive to what it's like to be a Holocaust victim might become sensitive if they were treated like a Holocaust victim, okay? And even the child who becomes a Nazi might become horrified at what he had to do in the role of a Nazi. That horror is partly an empathy with those he's mistreating, okay? So this role play kind of induction of or teaching of empathy is another technique. Now, how does all of this work in schools? Well, I can think of two ways. One, I'll just mention briefly, exchange students in a given school can help the students in the school understand better the point of view of distant others, okay? So exchange students is, that's a very good tool for creating a larger scale empathy with people who you don't personally know. But when you know someone who's in that group that you weren't familiar with, it increases your sense of what it's like to be in that larger group that is so distant, but made more present by the presence of the exchange student. But I think the other sort of more easier to accomplish and more pervasive way of making students in schools is to teach them about the history of oppressed people or of people who are suffering in one way or another from pestilence or disease or from hunger, is to teach them about it and maybe even have television or movies about these things, which get the students more aware of them than they would ever be in the normal course of events. So schools can have an educative role in creating greater empathy by revealing to students and immersing students in the situations of others who are less fortunate, let's say, than they are. Okay, now let me move on to a few other topics here. One thing somebody could say, and many psychologists and even philosophers have said this, is, well, okay, you're making the child more empathic, but how does that motivate them to be helpful? We automatically think that empathy makes you more helpful, but there's a literature in philosophy and psychology that says, well, empathy is one thing, helpfulness is another. What's the relationship between them? Let me briefly respond to that, because I think there's a very intimate relationship between them. When we empathize not only with the feeling of what some other person is feeling, but also with the object of that feeling. For example, if a father is infected empathically by his daughter's love of stamp collecting, her enthusiasm for stamp collecting, he doesn't just take in some generalized kind of enthusiasm, it's enthusiasm for stamp collecting, right? So empathy takes in not only an attitude, but what it's directed toward. Well, if you empathize with someone who is feeling pain, a sharp shooting pain in their arm, okay, they are distressed by the pain in their arm. If you empathize with their distress, you will become distressed by the pain in their arm. Now, by definition, if they're distressed by the pain in their arm, they want to alleviate it. Well, if you feel that same distress at that pain, you're going to want to alleviate it too. The desire to alleviate someone else's pain is altruistic. So altruistic motivation is built right into empathy from the start. And I think it's a mistake to separate empathy and altruism in the way that some psychologists have done. I've written at some length about this, and I'm convinced that empathy really is a kind of practical answer, that it is a motivational answer. Now, the liberals, the rationalist liberals who follow Kant and apply it to liberal social justice and social policy, don't emphasize empathy at all. That's not part of the basis for what they consider to be how morality is motivated, how moral goodness or moral dutifulness is motivated. They think that if you see that something is wrong and you have the rational understanding that it's wrong, that will automatically motivate you not to do it. Okay, this is very problematic, and the recent Kantian liberals realize that Kant gets in a certain amount of trouble with that assumption. They've tried to work their way around it. In my opinion, I'm not going to go into the details, they don't do a very good job of it. I think it's actually a lot easier to compass and psychologically understand how empathy can motivate us than to understand how rational understanding can motivate actual action. Okay, but let me go on. Now, let's talk about the advantages of empathically based care ethics over other forms of thinking about rightness and wrongness, other forms of theorizing. And here I'm responding partly to what Dr. Farrow said. Take utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, of course, emphasizes consequences, and we often call that consequentialism. Okay, but the trouble is that it's consequences conglomerated together and not individualized so that any particular group, okay, has a special status and is the object of special concern. So for the consequentialist, for the utilitarian, if you can improve the lot of the many by disadvantaging those who are already disadvantaged and making their situation even worse, that's all right to do. It's even obligatory if the total sum of happiness is greater at the disadvantage of the worst off. Well, I'm sorry. I think our common deep moral consciousness revolts against that idea. And in a way, this fits in with what Dr. Earle was saying about those who are lost, those who are outside our consideration, those who are the other. We, as human beings, and in our normal moral thinking, put much greater weight on the disadvantages of those who are already disadvantaged than we do on improving those who are already pretty well off. And that is what utilitarianism and consequentialism don't take into account. So although the emphasis on consequences, which you find in utilitarianism, is very notable, on these kinds of problematic cases, it doesn't do the job in a way that a more compassionate, and compassion is the stuff of empathy, okay? That a philosophy, a moral philosophy that emphasizes compassion will say, no, the worst off, the excluded, these have to be the object of our concern, even if you can do a greater amount of good for those who are already well off, you still have to give priority to the worst off. Now, then you might say, well, this sounds a little bit like Rawls. Some of you have read Rawls, and Rawls says he has this difference principle, okay, according to which, we should, in considering the distribution of benefits and burdens in society, we should always raise the level of those worst off as high as is possible, okay? And that, in a way, goes against utilitarianism, and Rawls says as much, okay? So this is an emphasis on the disadvantage. The trouble with this, however, is that it puts this kind of consideration of the worst off in second place. What's in first place in Rawls' scheme of justice is civil rights and the privilege of voting, okay? So Rawls thinks that before we consider the disadvantage, we first have to ensure that everyone has their civil liberties unviolated, they're honored. And what are the civil liberties? Right to free speech, assembly, movement, religious worship. These are more important than taking care of those who are worst off. Well, care ethics doesn't agree with that. And here I'm going to refer to what David scooped me. He anticipated what I was going to say about Skokie. Now, in Skokie, Illinois, in the 1970s, the neo-Nazis proposed to march and speechify about their hatred of Jews, and the town was chosen because there were a large number of Holocaust survivors living there. I don't remember if David pointed that out, but that is why that town was chosen. And so the liberals, the Rawlsian liberals, say, yes, well, we can't interfere with their right of freedom of expression. Okay, even if the Jewish Holocaust survivors in that town are going to be unhappy with this, we still have to allow them the freedom of speech because that takes priority over those. But you see, the point David made was it's not just that the Holocaust survivors would dislike what was happening or be offended. They would be damaged by it. It could re-traumatize them. Okay. Now, the liberals who talk about this, and I include, Thomas Nagel and T.M. Scanlon and Ronald Dworkin, they all say, well, we should allow for the free speech of those Nazis. But they never consider that it isn't just offensive to the Jews, it is damaging to the Jewish Holocaust survivors. And that emphasis on the damage to those who are already horribly off, these survivors, this ignoring of that in favor of civil liberties seems to me to be an uncaring thing and, morally speaking, offensive as a moral position. Okay, now let me give you another example where, again, the worst off, those who are badly off, are treated badly in order to preserve the civil liberty of others. Let's say a woman comes to a magistrate or a judge and says, look, my husband has threatened me and my children with violence, and I don't know what to do. Can you put a restraining order on him? Can you give us police protection or at least put a restraining order on him? So the liberal position is that you don't limit the freedom of movement of this husband until he's had a fair chance to respond to her accusation. Okay, that we put great weight on freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, and we can't really, we don't offend his right to freedom of movement just unilaterally by issuing a restraining order without giving him a chance to respond. So the next week, the magistrate proposes to have a meeting, a court appearance of the husband so he can defend himself. Well, of course, by then it's going to be too late, probably. Okay, and a real concern for the welfare of the children would put her welfare over the rights of freedom of movement. Yes, the husband doesn't want to be limited. If he's told he can't go within 1,000 feet of his wife and children, sure, that limits his freedom of movement. But that is certainly a lot less morally important than removing any chance that the woman will be injured or her children injured during that week. Forget the issue of police protection, because that might actually be a much better, a lot of husbands ignore, these kinds of orders of protection and the like. But anyway, again, liberalism gets the thing wrong. It places the civil liberty of freedom of movement ahead, at least in the first instance, and in the most important instance where the woman and her children could be injured, it places it ahead of the issues of welfare. So an ethics of care gets the matter right. Okay, seems to me that an ethics of care will place more value and importance on this woman's safety than on the freedom of movement of the husband. So again, Kantian liberalism gives us the wrong answers in these questions. Now, Kantian liberalism is great as a basis for understanding the importance of civil liberties and of the right to vote. Yes, absolutely. And it upholds democratic ideals in a very nice and very important way, but it goes astray with regard to other issues. And so what I'm saying is we have to filter the insights of liberalism through some of the greater and deeper and more humane perspective that you get from care ethics. Okay. Oh, now, David Hodge asked me to say a little bit about Chinese thought in relation to some of the things I've been saying. I have been spending a lot of time recently talking about the relationship between Chinese ethics and the ethics of care and empathy. The fact is, though, that the Chinese didn't really have the notion of empathy. Okay, they didn't have it, but they did have an ethics of caring. Okay, benevolence. Mencius, Mencius, the great follower of Confucius, placed benevolence as the most important of all the virtues. Okay, that's very much like the ethic of caring. So the Chinese do anticipate the Western attitude, but they don't have the full mechanism. We get that only from David Hume. Hume gives us empathy in a way the Chinese never really had it. Now, the other interesting thing about China, and I can't forbear to mention this, is there has never been a Chinese ethical rationalist. We get rationalism in Kant, we get a kind of rationalism in Rawls. There has never been a rational. They all place emotion and caring and benevolence before the idea that rationality will deliver the goods on our obligations to others. So that's an interesting final point. Now, let me finally, do I have time, David, to do this? Yeah, all right. Do I have time to, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Lachlan. I should have referred to you. Do I have time? Okay. To respond to what Dr. Earle said yesterday, which gave me a lot of food for thought. And I hope what I respond with will be interesting to him. Maybe he'll even want to respond to my response. He spoke yesterday about those who are out of the conversation, but also those who are out of our consideration, the other, okay? And it occurred to me that there's another category of the other which might teach us something about how to overcome otherness a bit. The group that is also other for most of us is animals. We go to the store. We pick up, we're looking for a pork loin. We buy it, we cook it, we eat it. We don't think about the living animal it was taken from. That's totally outside of our consideration. That is the other in that area too. Now, okay, so when Dr. Earle spoke about the Black community or Black people being the other with regard to most whites, I think part of it is they aren't considered, but also with regard to the issue of animals, they aren't considered either. So here's what I want to say about that, and I'd welcome his response if he wants to make one. It seems to me that empathy can only do its work if one focuses on the object that is going to be empathized with, that food. And what I want to say, oh, are you hearing me? Are people hearing me? No. Well, I hope you're hearing me. What we don't do with regard to our Black brothers and sisters, and especially the most disadvantaged of them, we don't actually focus on them. We don't want to think about them. And so, it's important to have empathy, but it's also important, and this is the point Dr. Earle made so eloquently, it's also important that they not be the other anymore. And I say that that means they have to be focused on in order for us to have empathy with them. They have to be within our focus. That takes them out of the category of the other. It takes animals, if we are concerned about animal welfare, and it takes human beings who are disadvantaged and wretched or lost and underserved. They have to be focused on for our ethics of care to really work. Thank you. I'm done.
All right. No, you get to pause. I'm going to take the role of moderator just to say 3 quick things, not for sort of conversation, but thanking you for this. One, when you're talking about a parent and a child who has hurt, another young child and then has gone off, and that what was most effective was for the parent to bring the child back and have the child reflect on what he had done. That's exactly the kind of thing at a larger scale and maybe more historical distance that I was having in mind, thinking about each of us as individuals looking back at our past. This was a minutes ago past, but I think the same principle is, I think we learn by looking back at ways in which we weren't what we would want to be, and that pains us. Right. So I thought there were lessons in that example that extend far beyond parents for children.
That's very nice. Thank you. Yes, that's very helpful.
A second comment. I mentioned yesterday that Albert Schweitzer, Dr. Schweitzer, had done his first, he had 3 doctoral degrees. His first dissertation was on Immanuel Kant and Kant's religious philosophy, and ended up in despair when, for Dr. Schweitzer, World War I proved what he had been predicting, which was the ethics of Kant had no traction in European society. The country of Kant was slaughtering people in vast numbers. And then I just dug out one, and in searching all over the world for different routes, in a book about unpublished things, the author says, Schweitzer makes the point, he studied China, ancient China, and specifically Mencius, and says Chinese thinkers of antiquity, specifically Mencius, had a much better grasp of the issues, including empathy, surrounding ethics than those in Europe. So even 100 years ago, Schweitzer was finding in China, ancient China and Mencius, things that he'd never found in Europe. Right, so I want to just embrace that. But next, before we get to more conversation, because I promise we're going to do justice to the questions in the Q&A. So one of the questions here from Bianca Alsena, Bianca, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your last name, who is one of David's bioethics honors students, who, if I'm remembering right, is a descendant of one of the men in the study. And her question is the following, which, Michael, you've thought lots and lots about, written a whole book about ethics and psychology, right? And how do they connect? And Bianca's question is this: historically, Black Americans and our feelings have been disregarded due to the dehumanization of people of African descent. Also, the field of psychology has often been reduced to an art in quotation marks. I think it's I think at its best, it's an art that is an art is a highly disciplined thing. And actually, as an aside, people today contrast in medicine, the art of medicine or the technical things, but in ancient Greece, the word techne was actually a word used for artists who were highly skilled technicians creating aesthetic great objects. So the Greeks didn't see this, just separating technology, science, skill, rigor with what art is it requires. But getting back to Bianca, says the field of psychology has often been reduced to an art in quotation marks, or pseudoscience, really, rather than a legitimate science discipline. When utilizing psychological research for eliminating biases and for promoting empathy, when using psychological research, how do we combat the miseducation of bioethics and lack of empathy involved in most psychological research, which ends up being not respected and criticized? So I think in Bianca's question, you might take that as a starting point, Michael, for what's the relationship between what we understand from psychological research and psychology and ethics and empathy, and how might students like Bianca, who's deeply interested in psychology and deeply interested in ethics, see that the two together are really inseparable in terms of the kind of progress we need to make?
Okay, yes, let me say something about that. It's a very good question. And, most psychologists do experimental work that can't properly be called humanistic. In fact, they have the term humanistic psychology, and it's a somewhat negative term among psychologists. But, I'm happy to espouse that term. I am, to the extent I do psychology, I'm a humanistic one. But the fact is that a lot of, for example, cognitive psychology, the cognitive psychologists don't want to hear about motivation. And since ethics is a matter as much of motivation as it is of skill, I mean, to be a good person, you have to know what to do, but you also have to be motivated to do it. So virtue and goodness and concern are not just skills. They're not just an art acquired as a skill. They also require motivation. All right. So the thing is that a lot of psychologists, and in particular, I'm thinking of the cognitive psychologists, aren't interested in issues of motivation, and except insofar as motivation may skew the cognitive apparatus in some way or another. Okay. I mean, they give examples where the motivation to please might make you change your judgment in one direction or another. But in general, the trouble with the field of psychology from the standpoint of the humanistic psychology is that it's not humanistic enough, and it doesn't pay enough attention to or give much appreciation for humanistic psychology. I wish more psychologists saw the research they do as feeding into what a humanistic psychology can do with their research. I think lots of the very impersonal and very experimental things that psychologists do can feed it. Let me give you an example of this that Martin Hoffman in his book, what is it called? Empathy and Moral Development, talks about. Can empathy be learned later on in life, or is it something that is sort of fixed by a certain age? Well, they did a study, okay? They took some youthful offenders, people in their late teens and early 20s, and they were in prison or jail, or I guess prison. They had done bad things, and they were asked to volunteer. They were asked to volunteer to be in a study, which was, they were told, was supposed to make them more empathic. Well, they were subjected to various scenarios and stories and films and things. And I can't remember the details of what the study did. But in fact, they tested much more positively for empathy after the study was done than before. So, a strictly administered psychological experiment can teach us things that are morally relevant, that you don't have to give up hope on the young, that you don't have to learn empathy all before the age of 10, and then you're lost forever. No. There are ways of inducing empathy later on. So what I say is, look, I wish psychologists weren't so buried in the sheer experimental character of what they do and had more of a sense and interest in the ethical relevance of what they do. And they would see that it can contribute. They might even work toward making such contributions. And on the other hand, I think care ethicists and humanistic psychologists need to be very mindful of what they can learn from the purely experimental.
So the next question, I'm going to invite each of you to comment on, and I'm going to broaden it. It's from Lisa, Balance or Balance. Lisa, apologies if I'm not pronouncing right. This came in about 25 minutes ago, Michael, when you were talking about what parents or other can do with young children to foster empathy. A development of empathy. And she says, is this not disrupted when children have experienced trauma? Is this not linked to later life lack of empathy? I'm going to connect that in my question to try to provoke each of you. And this time, we haven't heard from my brother David in a while, but each of you says, is not the development of empathy disrupted when children have experienced trauma? Connect that to what Bianca observed about the dehumanization of people of African descent. I'm old enough to remember and then have read back a couple of decades ago, and a lot of this country bought into this, including liberals, the problem of crime in urban areas, and people were talking about Black predators, these young Black youth who were just predators. We need to identify them and put them in jail. Right? That was, a lot of people kind of embraced that. I think from Lisa's question about early trauma, if we ask ourselves, even leaving aside a term like Black predator, which is just trying to reduce them to like not even human, and ask ourselves, for lots of people who in young adulthood or beyond are not empathic caring, and trace back to what was their childhood like? In what ways were they brutalized? And rather than blaming them, see them, and Reverend Dr. Martha King talked about this often, we blame people who are living the results of earlier racism, trauma, and all of that, rather than understanding where that came from and addressing the underlying causes. So, Brother David, as you're sitting leading the National Center for Bioethics, are there thoughts that this sparks about as not just developing empathy and the difficulties when there's childhood trauma, but also for people who have had childhood trauma are not living lives of empathy? How do we respond to them with empathy, including understanding why they may have become who they are?
Thank you very much, Lachlan, and thanks for the efficiency that you had today. Thank you very much, Dr. Sloat and Dr. Earl, for your presentations as we continue. Actually, Lachlan, okay, there's a thing called ACE. ACE is Adverse Childhood Experience. And we've spent a whole lot of time on that at the National Center. And as Dr. William, who he put in a comment earlier that I responded to, and as Dr. Earl suggested, it is hard to accomplish anything without resources. So even though we tried to give time and energy to it, we couldn't make much traction. But adverse childhood experiences focuses on the traumas of the young and some of the generational traumas that have been impacted and imposed upon young people, and how we could do what we could do to eliminate it. So it lends itself to a question that I had for both of these gentlemen, and is a question, and Lachlan, you could chime in as well, because there's a part of the question that's very familiar to you. Dr. Sloat expanded upon Dr. Earl's idea by bringing in animals. And I suggest that another expansion will be to bring in the environment and climate change and the nuclear holocaust. And its effect will be upon those who are the least lost and left out the most than anybody else. So, but I bring that in terms of justice and social justice. And so the first part of the question that will go to Michael Sloat is Grace Clement, and I know you, Grace Clement in her book on ethics of care says that one of the problems is that justice doesn't really work or fit into care ethics because it is too abstract, and care ethics is relational and concrete. But on the other hand, social justice is trying to move away from the abstraction and come to where it's on the ground. So please, both Dr. Sloat and Dr. Earl, say something about social justice, and Lachlan, you too, please, because part of the agenda, and there's a grant we're about to work on, part of the agenda for the center is a social justice one, and the environment and environmental justice and environmental care and climate change and nuclear holocaust and the doomsday clock is upon us. So I would like the three of you to, even if you have to define what this means for the audience, what all these terms mean, define it so that everyone can get a kind of robust feel of what this means. So when we attack it at the center as a Black bioethics thing, it'll be understood why. And if you could go first, I don't mind.
Right. Let me go first with, again, I'm going to talk about Dr. Schweitzer. When he was in Africa, I mentioned yesterday, and had this suddenly crystallized this phrase. He was thinking of the Buddha, compassion for all life, Ehrfurcht vor dem Leben in German, reverence for all life. He included all life, including animal life. So Rachel Carson dedicated Silent Spring to him, the book that launched the environmental movement. The Animal Welfare Institute for decades in the United States, their highest award is the Albert Schweitzer Award. So he connected all of these things. But I want to give, and he was the first doctor speaking out about nuclear weapons, which he thought was the antithesis of valuing life. But I want to give one very, very concrete example. We have programs across the country where we take graduate students in health professions, nurses, doctors, medical students, public health students, divinity students, others, and they have to come up with a program that they spend a year doing with some mentoring while they're in school, addressing an important unmet need in the local community in a way that has enduring value. And that's part of how they learn experientially, I will say, what the suffering in the communities is really like, not in a classroom, being out there with the people, and what can I do about this? Because I'm uncomfortable when I've seen that suffering. Decades ago, one of our Boston Schweitzer Fellows was a veterinary student named Leonard. I'll give you just his first name. Black, grown up in inner city Chicago, and deeply concerned about youth violence. And his project, which I just loved, he said, was with middle school kids in Roxbury and Dorchester who were living traumatized by violence. His project, he said, I grew up in that kind of neighborhood. I cannot help them, in Michael's language, understand and learn empathy in an environment that is so hostile to that. To survive, they've got to be so tough. So what he did was every Saturday, he went in, he got to know the kids, and he took a bunch of them out to Grafton, Massachusetts, to the veterinary school, and have them spend the day with the animals. And in a different setting, a different context, they loved the animals, they connected with the animals, and but they then experienced within themselves a way of being around other life that they hadn't even dared let themselves experience back in Roxbury and Dorchester. So I think all of these things are interconnected. A book, if people are interested, by one of my greatest moral philosophy teachers, Martha Nussbaum. Her most recent book is called Justice for Animals, where she takes theories of justice, but actually for her, it all originates at the deepest level with awe, reverence for life, out of that compassion, out of that anger and rage when life is threatened and vulnerable. And then out of that, she thinks we need ethics to know what we do about that. And she applies that to how we should be thinking about animals. So there are others that have connected these things. But I think Dr. Schweitzer, I know Dr. Schweitzer believed all of the problems that we're seeing as moral problems are in some ways just symptoms of a deeper underlying problem that Dr. Schweitzer's language he thought was inadequate reverence, awe, wonder, and with that compassion. He used the word empathy a lot, is the way it's translated into English. Although before I hand over, I was going to mention yesterday, the word empathy, this is indulging myself, family moment. My grandfather, A.C. Reed, was a longtime professor of philosophy at Wake Forest University, but before that, he created chair of the psychology department. He got his PhD in psychology in about 1910 at Cornell with a professor, Edward Titchener, who coined the term empathy and tried to study that in rigorous ways. What exactly is that experience? So we need science to understand how things work. But I've talked already longer than I meant to, and I would love comments from Michael and from Pop. And I wonder, Michael, in your comments, whether it's reflecting on what I said about Leonard and the students and how they come to think about things, things you've learned from your study of China and Chinese philosophers, where they don't separate intellect, cognitive things, reason, from emotion as if they're separate things. Neuroscientists have today said, we never have a thought as a human being that doesn't have some emotion connected. We can't even name an emotion without having a thinking, like a label for that. And in China, the word they use, really, you have to translate that as heart-mind, not as two things came together. They're always inseparable in real human beings. So, Michael, do you want to take David's comments and then Pop and run some with this?
Well, I'm going to work backwards because I want to respond immediately to what you just said. Yes, the Chinese use the word xin to describe what we can translate as heart mind. And the Japanese have a similar word. It's only the Far Eastern cultures that have words for heart mind. Japanese say kokoro, and the Koreans say maum, and it all means not mind, but heart mind. So one of the things I've been doing in my own work is trying to show that they're right and that we in the West are wrong. Now, the Western scientists who now say you can't have a belief without having an emotion attached to it still think of these phenomena as correlated and as causally interacting. But the Chinese actually thought of it as a more intimate relationship. They thought belief itself had an emotional twinge or tinge to it, okay? And that's what I think is actually the case. I've written actually 2 books illustrating this point. I'm not going to go, advertising them. But the point is that, in fact, I think the connection between reason and emotion is even deeper than current neuroscientists tend to think. Now, let me go back to Lisa's thing about trauma.
Dr. Sloan, can you please mention them, advertise them so that the readers outside.
Okay. Yeah, these were books published in China by their leading press, the commercial press. In 2018, the first one was published. It's called The Philosophy of Yin and Yang. Okay, it's 2018, and then a sequel to that is coming out next year from the same press. But maybe I won't mention the title. Well, I can mention the title, but it's not out yet. It's called A Larger Yin-Yang Philosophy. So yes, and I've also, if anyone wants to write to me about this, my email address is msloat@miami.edu, and I'd be happy to supply them with more than they would even want. Okay. So anyway, let me say a little more about Lisa's question about trauma. Yes, trauma can create a lack of empathy, but I like to use the word abuse, childhood abuse. If a child is locked in the closet and never allowed out, or if they're raped repeatedly by their uncle, okay, it's trauma. It's also the highest or worst kind of abuse. This can derail the capacity for empathy, but it doesn't have. Okay, so American Black experience. Black Americans were slaves.
Dr. Sloat, you froze for a moment. So after the but continue from there.
Oh, let me focus on an item that's really at the center of everything we're talking about here, namely the experience of slavery. No one has mentioned it so far, but wasn't that traumatic? And yet somehow it didn't debar the former slaves or even those who were slaves. It didn't debar them from developing a capacity for humanity and concern for others and empathy. So I want to say this. Yes, some of the Black kids who go to prison now and who have absolutely no compunction about hurting others may show a lack of empathy, but trauma in childhood needn't have that effect. It can, in fact, create greater empathy. If you are suffering, you may become more aware of the suffering of others and want to avoid for them what you know so horribly occurred to you. On the other hand, the suffering can make you indifferent to others. There are 2 outcomes of childhood trauma. Each is possible. We need to learn more from the psychologists and from ourselves about how these different outcomes can occur. Okay, so I think that's all I want to say. Yeah.
All right, Pop.
Yes, very, very fascinating. I'm intrigued by what I hear from you, both of you. I think Dr. Hart's participated too, so all 3 of you. But here's what I'm struggling with. So, the longer I live and the more I'm challenged to address subjects of this nature, as in terms of my own discipline, etc., that Is it that we have created a kind of naivete in the Western world, especially the wealthy, those who have the resources to fund it? Moral discourse that is naive about what it means to be human. And I heard that as Dr. Sloat made his later comments, that, you know, I live in any city you can go in, and you, on one side of town, you hear certain kinds of conversations. You go on other side of town, where the resources are more plentiful, and you hear another kind of conversation. And they're often conversations that have, if they don't have moral, if they're not moral at the core, they have moral implications. And I don't mean to ignore the realities of human pain and human suffering, but I am concerned that we're living in a society that has some illusions about, painful illusions. You hear it in the conversations of the younger generation about not only what it means to be human, but it's inevitable that you face it if you are going to remain human, or if you're going to live in the zone of humanity. It is no way of getting around it. And when I first started teaching at the University of Tennessee, I used to hear white kids say to me, I'm taking this course because I want to know what did Black people have. This was a particular course I taught on religion. It would come under the category of religion and slavery. And what did they have that allowed them to be so, really what they were saying, they didn't use the terms, but to be so human and compassionate. Now, sometimes you're dealing with, when kids ask this kind of a question, you remember, okay, they grew up in the home of a Black maid or somebody who taught them certain, they taught them care ethics. It wasn't so much from their mothers or fathers. They taught because they spent more time with these people who were rearing them. And I grew up in a generation where many of our parents had worked those homes and reared those children, and they called them their children. And I didn't spend time, I didn't get to know my real mother, biological mother, until I was probably about 12 years old. But my grandmother, my biological mother,
Bob, you froze.
did was interesting. She did that kind of but for the yeah, what it was it the market?
Lachlan, one of the things I could do is, well, to Dr. Earl come back up, is respond to something earlier. And that is, I think found interest, and Dr. Sloat attempted an answer, and that is about Cutler. Niebuhr, Reinhold Niebuhr, was a Christian pacifist and a Christian realist until the emergence of Adolf Hitler. And he said that Hitler's regime is so bad, then there's no empathy that could be afforded. There's no growth that could be afforded with this. We need to switch to what he called Christian realism. So the pacifists, the pacifists, the work of the pacifists is unhelpful if the situation is that tragic or traumatic. And I know that's not what you asserted, but with John Cutler, is not so much his negligence when it comes to, or the negligent language when it comes to the men in the syphilis study, but the part that is worse is what was done in Guatemala, because in Guatemala, he was over that program that infected poor prostitutes, orphans, and others, at about 1,200, 250, with syphilis. So that is a damage, to use Dr. Sloat's word. That is a tragedy. That's an abuse, and that's awful. So there's not too much space that we could give to ponder about how badly a person or how we should feel about another person who is doing things to inflict trauma and hurt on others. I think that we have greater use of our time. Yeah, I'll get you. I think we should have greater use of our time by helping those who are being traumatized and try to figure out the trauma, whatever the nefarious person. Okay, now Pop, you're back now. Go ahead.
Yes, the point that, and thank you, dear. And in summary, the point I'm trying to make is, it seems as though that if we look at the world in a larger picture, that it's the people that we often, the so-called ruling class, the people who have what they think is the power, need the marginalized to rear their children and to help teach them, to help civilize them. And really, that's just a kind of harsh word that the early conquerors used. They were more free to say, okay, you need to be civilized. But in child rearing and in rearing, trying to rear up the baby to be a human is a challenge, because it kind of runs in the flies in the face of our religious understanding that we're human before we're born. And that's a debate that we can get, that I don't have time to get into now. But what do we learn? And it seems to me that the Bioethics Center is challenged with the kind of conversation, or to prepare leaders with the kind of conversation that we are involved in, we've been involved in this session. And I find it so valuable, because what happens in a society where your technology and your machines are replacing, and maybe your AI is going to replace the nurturers of the culture, those who nurture the next generation? Will they be, will most of the nurturing take place through machines and technology, or will it take place through the spirit of other humans? And then what will they know about compassion? And it seems to me that we once identified the lower and the outcast. Okay, if Black kids come up, I'm not romanticizing and saying that, okay, celebrate Black kids coming up in poverty, but at least we categorized those people and said, the society did, and said, okay, they don't have any feelings. Are we also rearing up a group of upper class, which we haven't given a lot of attention to, upper class youngsters who lack the feelings, and I don't want to sentimentalize, overly sentimentalize feelings, but are we rearing up youngsters who have we're going to run into a danger of their feelings being nurtured and cultivated to have care and compassion for the other, whether it's caring for those in nursing homes or caring for those in ghettos or in tribal communities, etc. I think the session has been so provocative for me that I could envision you even thinking about a part 2, but somewhere down the road.
Right. I'm going to take, because it's 2:55. Thanks, and I'm going to take the prerogative moderator to say a few, what I hope are unifying words, and then each ask Michael, then Pop, then David, in just a sentence or two, what you hope the people who've been here will go away thinking or wondering about. I'm going to take my part of my inspiration from President Obama's Nobel acceptance speech. I'm going to read just a few words. He says, I received this honor with deep gratitude and great humility. It is an award that speaks to our highest aspirations, that for all the cruelty and hardship of our world, we are not mere prisoners of fate. Our actions matter and can bend history in the direction of justice. Then he goes on to say, I'm at the beginning, not the end of my labors on the world stage. Compared to some of the giants of history who've received this prize, and then he says, Schweitzer and King, Marshall and Mandela, my accomplishments are slight. So he starts naming Schweitzer and King, and I'm in reverse order because I think it relates to our theme, especially at the end. Dr. King said, of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and inhuman, often misquoted as inhumane. That's not what he said. He said inhuman, the antithesis of being human, the equality. I think what the 625 men experienced exemplifies shocking, inhumane, inhuman. And then in a great anthology of Schweitzer's ethical writings, Professor Predrag Cicovacci, who studied Kant under Louis Weick Beck and then edited Beck's papers, knew Kant, but then he discovered Schweitzer, and he actually found Schweitzer more helpful. The first line is, quote from Albert Schweitzer. What was Schweitzer's greatest aspiration? He quotes Schweitzer as saying, I have given up the ambition to become a great scholar. I want to be more, simply a human. Right. So every one of us, it's a question, what do we aspire to be? We are human. To show what that means to be human, the National Center is going to do that in two ways. One, what was inhuman that led to our creation, but then also show what it means to be human, which I think is inseparable from care, empathy, compassion, connecting. So in the last couple of minutes, first Michael, then Pop, and then closing sentence from David. Are there a sentence or two that you hope people will go away from this that they should be thinking, wondering about as we finish in a minute?
Okay, I guess I'm supposed to go first. You just spoke about human aspirations, and I'd like people to think a little bit more about grown-ups, people who are adults like ourselves, not the children, not the babies, not the teenagers. How does a person of mature years become a better person? How much of a say do they have in it? How much do external events make a difference to it? What is the process, if there is a process, of becoming and aspiring to become and becoming a better person? That's what I'd like people to think about.
Right, Pop.
Yeah, I would like for them to go away with the question, of to what degree am I romanticizing, or am I as an individual caught up in a global community that is afflicted by a being ahistorical, the lack of memory of the people who have lived on this planet for thousands of years, called Earth, lived on the planet Earth. Am I so caught up in my sense of individualism that I have lost the capacity to remember? And I think that's what the Tuskegee Syphilis Experience, the Ethics Center here, all of that stuff is really jogging our memory, or at least challenging us to remember. Thank you.
All right, last word, David, and then close us out as you do. For people here, the rest of us, Brother David. You're on mute. You're on mute, Brother David. Start over. Now you're on mute again.
Okay. No, I'm not on mute. Okay, I'm gonna give my last words after I give my thank yous. My wife suggested, and the best way to say thank you in this regard is my wife, and she's looking at it right now. She said, you know, this is your the first major thing that you've done as a director of the National Center. She said to have your father in philosophy, your father in theology, and your brother in arms, because Lachlan, we didn't mention earlier, he is the co-chair of the Advisory Council for the National Center for Bioethics and Research in Healthcare. To have this particular group of family members on this is immeasurable. To kick this off, this is going to be on YouTube years from now. Young people and adults, as Dr. Sloat says, will be learning and studying from this. So thank you, each and every one of you, gentlemen. I want to say also that on the 6th through the 7th, or not the 6th to the 7th, that Monday, begins that Monday, and it goes that entire weekend, the first week of November, we have our commemoration and our public health ethics intensive. Our foci for that day, for those days, is autism, mental health, suicide prevention, and lupus. Those are the things we'll be focusing. My final words for today is this. J.D. Otis Roberts, in his book on Black Theology and Reconciliation, the first chapter, the last paragraph, he said something along these lines: our goal is to be more fully human. And I think that's our challenge for us. How do we be more fully human? I love you. I love you. I appreciate you showing up and participating. Assalamu alaikum, peace, shalom, and blessings upon you. Thank you each
and I'm going to make you repeat, because Natasha Earl says, will you please say the dates again for the next event? And I believe Ashanti Ali Davis has people's emails. We'll make sure you get those. But David, we had that last request because we take questions seriously.
The Public Health Ethics Intensive will be the 6th through the 10th of November. 6th through the 10th of November. Begin with the commemoration, the Public Health Ethics Institute, that Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and the intensive. And on that Friday, we have something for youth as well as a major program. So thank you very much. It will all be live on Zoom. All right. You all have a wonderful Thank you for using your Saturday to come and see us and to participate in this. Thank you very much. Take care.